that people have joined. So welcome everyone to today's CPC Connecting Generations webinar. Our speaker for today is Albert Esteve. Albert is Professor of Sociology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, as well as the Director of the Centre for Demographic Studies. He's also the former editor of the European Journal of Population and currently serves as the Rector of the European Doctoral School in Demography and leads the ERC Advanced Grant Project called Co-Residence, which studies the factors that drive differences in patterns of intergenerational co-residence around the world. And today he'll be presenting on living arrangements in transition, global patterns, and regional idiosyncrasies. So I'll pass over to Albert now to get started.
Okay, so let me ask you, Sarah, whether you can see the screen and everything looks correct.
Yep, I can see it all looks great.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very pleased to present a little bit of a summary of all the research we have been doing within the Co-Residence project over the last 3 years. For me, I think it's increasingly difficult to present the results of a single paper because I have the feeling that as the famous writer from Latin America, Gabriel García Márquez, was asked once, which is your favorite book that you've written? And he said, I'm only writing one book, but in different volumes. And I kind of have the feeling that despite different papers, I'm kind of researching the same thing. So today I've decided to give you an overview of what we're doing and which are the main conclusions that are coming from all this research that a very nice team is doing here in Barcelona. So let me give you a little bit of context. So I care a lot about living arrangements because for me they have very broad implications for the economy, social and cultural reproduction of societies. They define structures of everyday life, and it's also a very nice dependent variable because you can see through them the impact of large societal transformations like demographic change, economic change, cultural influences, but also they mirror lots of individual life course transitions. When we become parents, when we divorce, when our partners die, when we leave parental home. So there's many macro and micro level transformations shaping the structures of living arrangements, and it's very nice to study how do they change over time. But it's also very nice to study that the way these living arrangements change over time do not always reflect what social theorists predicted. And there is a line of reasoning within living arrangements literature and household composition literature that states that with economic change, cultural change, modernization, and so on, in the long run, we should expect some sort of a convergence in living arrangements, and more complex and extended ways of intergenerational co-residence should tend to disappear, and then they will move towards a more nuclear, small households, only partner and children, and if you don't have partner, living alone, and so on. So when we see the world, we see basically that this kind of gradual convergence to a nuclear system of living arrangements is not necessarily taking place. So let me summarize what we are seeing and what we are learning from this big analysis, and then I will develop. So I'm basically starting with the conclusions, and I will try to provide evidence to support some of the claims that I'm going to make in these initial slides. What we are seeing is basically that basic demographic change is the factor that has the most uniform effect on living arrangements. And it's true that fertility is going down, and as because of declines in fertility, we see a reduction of the household size. So the presence of children within households is lower, and this is a universal trend. But we are also seeing that because of population aging and also increases in survival, so high levels of life expectancy, longevity, we also see a very uniform trend to seeing the living arrangements of older people living more alone, only with a partner. So a higher level of isolation from the point of view of the household among older people. However, these are perhaps the two most uniform and clear trends. What we're seeing is that there's a lot of substantial heterogeneity across societies, and the way households are organized and the way intergenerational co-residence among two adult generations is taking place. It really shows a very, very diverse and world, basically. And I'll try to show you a little bit of this. So what we're doing now in the project is that trying to understand which are these regional idiosyncrasies, which are these regional specificities, to examine a little bit how do these regional specificities differ by gender, what happens at different life stages, old people, young people, children, and how do living arrangements also vary by social class. In the only way I have to approach some sort of measure of social stratification is education. So that's what we're doing within this co-residence project, which, as Sarah was saying, was funded 3 years ago by the European Research Council. So we like to document these variations across societies. We like to understand, and we like to explain. So it's a very inductive project. Let's see what happens, and then try to see. We all have the main theories in our minds, but let's try to see how can we re-explain and we can put together an explanation that help us to understand how living arrangements are organized and how do they evolve over time. Okay, and I'm doing this with a very nice group of people who are in different stages of their career. Some of them are doing the dissertation with me, and others are basically more data-driven persons and so on. And so in case you want to know, these are the faces and the names of the persons who are really contributing to the job. And the first job so the first mission of this project was, is it possible to explore, understand households and living arrangements from a global perspective? Is it possible to carry out a project that includes as many countries as possible? So we have spent at least the first 2 years of the project trying to gather data from as many countries as possible, with the only with the main condition that we were looking for individual microdata, but we were also looking for individual microdata that individuals are organized into households. So we have household level data and individual microdata, ideally longitudinal data, but this is very rare, very difficult to find in a consistent way across countries. But for us, it was good to have just a cross-sectional data set coming from surveys and censuses where we could identify individuals nested in to households. And this is a very nice graph where I show the number of countries that we are including in our analysis. In this graph, I organized them by continent. So you have the individual countries here, time on the horizontal axis. We see that there's a very coverage from the 1960s to the 2020s. And we are combining data from census, the IPOMs, demographic surveys, labor force surveys, some UNICEF surveys that are very nice too, and other sources. So we had to use data from specific surveys in Japan, from Australia, from Sweden. We had to use registered data. So we had to fill some of the gaps that we couldn't fill with IPOMs, DHS, or labor force surveys, in order to produce a map of the world that covers the entire world. So this is just an illustration of what we have included in one of our first database of, this is just showing the average household size at the national level using the latest available data since year 2000. And as you can see, it's the coverage is almost universal. We combine also data from the United Nations for some countries, but also you can see how diverse is the size of the households across societies. One of the features of the database, our database, is that we like to go to the subnational level in order to have more sample size, in order to test our structural hypotheses, how demographic change is playing, how economic change, cultural legacies, and so on. The more units of observation, the better. And this is a beautiful map that really shows the average household size at the subnational level. So that's very unique of our project. And the good news is that we're sharing these data, and they are open, and you can download it after my talk and start playing with it and so on. Okay. Another challenge we had is lots of research on households is taking the household as unit of observation. But as you know, households don't have sex, households don't have educational attainment, households they don't have, well, you can have wealth if you combine, but they don't have marital status. You can include members of different statuses. So we decided that for our purposes, it was much better to use the term living arrangement. So basically, with whom you are living. Okay, and then that allow us for more individual level analysis. That allow us for disentangling, like difference by sex, or difference by educational attainment, difference by economic activity, differences by marital status. So all the individual level variables that are usually collected in censuses and surveys. So we are now, we recently published a paper where we present the global living arrangements database, where the key thing is the individual perspective. So basically, using the household structure of our data, we can we can create some sort of pointer variables that tell us this person is living with a partner, is living with their own children, is living with other relatives, is living. So we are identifying living with children, parents, partner, grandchildren, other relatives, non-relatives. So you can have multiple combinations of this type of members. And then from those multiple combinations, we can create a more simplified structure of living arrangements. So I think this was a very nice way of, for us, it's been very useful to do lots of research with the living arrangements database. No? One of the most beautiful, I think, visualizations that we can get from the global living arrangements database is that we can now classify living arrangements by age, men and women in the United States in 1960, year 2000. And here, for instance, the purple indicates that these 5-year-olds are living with parents. Some are with parents and grandparents together. The red is I'm living only with my partner. The blue is I'm living with my partner and my children, and so on. So it's with this kind of classification, then you can play a lot and you can test many hypotheses, many other things that I'll show you in a minute. So we have two databases, so the household level database and the living arrangement database. And now, after we got the data, we start exploring, And here I like to show you a little bit, summarize some of the results. First thing I told you is that if there is a uniform trend across societies regarding households, is that the average household size is declining everywhere. They range from 9 persons in Senegal to 1.6 persons in Norway. This is kind of the observed range we have now at the global level. But as you can see from these lines, it's going down. It's going down and it's decreasing a lot, which basically means that the large households are disappearing and the small households are going up. And one of the most clear manifestations of this going up for small households is another universal trend, which is more people are living alone. And then I know in the UK and many societies, there's a lot of research on that, and problems of loneliness and social isolation and many other things. So this is also a panel graph where we saw for males and females using the GLAD, the living arrangements database, what's happening. So whether what percentage of the total population is living alone, and also what we're doing now is investigating which is the socio-demographic profile of these people living alone. And what we are seeing basically is that do not longer respond to old age women becoming widow, but they are emerging in other life stages among people with different marital status, educational attainments, and so on. Okay. Another important trend that we're seeing globally. So we have the household decline, more people living alone, but also is a new role of women within households, at least when we measured through the traditional sources. And one thing is the increase in female headship, basically. As you know, in many societies, when people answer a survey or a census, they say, who's the head or the reference person of the household? And that used to be a man. But the things are changing. And things are changing because of two reasons. So 50% of the change is because there are more households where there are no adult men present. So either because women live alone or women live alone with their own children, or the other 50% is because it's more likely now that everywhere in the world that women who happen to live with adult men, probably likely their partners, are increasingly reported as the heads or the reference persons of those households. So that's also very clear in the Americas, very clear in Europe, that's going down. Always messy in Africa. The trends are more difficult to find, but there's some sort of an overall increase of the presence of women as heads, both because the living arrangements are changing, but also the reporting of who's the head is also changing. And what we are also doing is to decompose the differences between men and women in living arrangements. And this is a very nice visualization where we have age, and we have United States, Mexico, Zimbabwe, and Indonesia. And this is the gap. So how different are the living arrangements of men and women in that particular age? Okay. And for instance, in Indonesia, we see that main difference emerge at older ages. In other countries, it's smaller. Of course, there are almost no difference among children. Either you're a male children or female children. Most of the differences emerge during the transition to adulthood, because women marry younger, because women have children earlier in their life than men, and so on. And that kind of creates this different structure of living arrangements. In the societies where there is divorce and union dissolution, that also creates another layer of complexity and another layer of differences between men and women. So we are basically studying all these differences and modeling them. So today I'm not presenting the models. The paper is under review, but this is a summary of how important is this gap between men and women. Here we are representing all the countries in the world. Okay, and in all the countries of the world, we can measure the gap between men and women in living arrangements. And we, as I told you, no differences before age 15. And then in Africa, the green color is where we have the largest differences between men and women. In Europe is where we have the smallest difference between men and women. But as you know, they change, or they are different depending on your life stage. And basically they mirror differences in union formation, in union dissolution, in who takes care of children when there is a union dissolution, what happens to old age people when they become widows, and so on. All of these life course transitions kind of basically combine to create these differences between men and women. And we're trying to model that and understand how it's changing. Another trend that I told you that it's very uniform, it's what's happening among all people. And here we see an increasing trend among all people to live independently of young generations. So either because they live alone or they live only with a partner, like in a nuclear household without adult children present in the household. And this is also something that when we look at the proportions of individuals 65 plus living independent, we are seeing that there's kind of an increase over time, showing a trend towards more independent living arrangements among older persons. Okay, we are modeling that. We have some macro level models that kind of explain a lot of the differences that we have in living arrangements across society. So this is a way of looking at these models where we show and predict also the proportion of individuals aged 65 plus living independent. And we have different data sets depending on data availability. But here we organize all countries. The box plots are the summary of countries. And we organize them based whether they are very young countries in terms of population structure or very old countries in terms of population structure. And as you can see, there's some sort of a linear trend that in the societies, Western societies, where proportion of elderly is very high, the proportion of elderly living alone is independently is higher than in very young societies, which probably they have more availability of care and so on. So there's some sort of a very nice correlation. The same happens if we measure it in a human developmental index scale. So high developed countries, more independent aging, and also we using some sort of secularity, more cultural indicators using the Engelhardt scale and so on. And we also see, so we basically modeling all the things and to see whether there is a correlation, and we can expect in the future that how living arrangements of old persons will evolve in the next 20, 30 years, given the amount of demographic change that we know it's coming in many countries. You know? So this is basically regarding the general trends, okay? But another key message I like to give you is that there's a lot of heterogeneity and there's a lot of specificities when we look at differences across societies. And something that we found out very, very early in our project is that it is true that the household size is going down across societies, but this is mainly driven because the presence of children is going down because of fertility decline. So in this graph, I show you African countries, American countries, Asia, Europe, and here is the average number of children within households, and you see that it's going down, and this is strongly correlated to fertility decline. But there are other persons in the households. You can have parents, you can have children, you can have grandparents, you can have grandchildren, you can have other relatives, you can have non-relatives. So if we don't count, if we exclude partners and children, what we're seeing is that the average number of other relatives in the household, it's kind of stable. So what we see is that there's a decline in household size, but at the same time, there's a persistence of the complexity that it's present in every society. So if it's common intergenerational coresidence with grandparents, you have grandparents with less grandchildren, but you still have the grandparents there. So it's this persistence complexity. It's something that now is taking a lot of time in our research and trying to understand which are the specific family arrangements that create this complexity in every region. That's what we're doing, what we call the sources of heterogeneity, the sources of complexity. And here I'm going to highlight some of the reasons why we see this persistence of complexity across societies, and which are the regions in every particular region. So one example is Latin America. And what we call family anchored transitions, meaning that we cannot assume in Latin America that when people marry or when people move into cohabitation with a partner, they are creating a nuclear household. They live independent of their parents. So this shows for Mexico, where we managed to get some longitudinal data, that regardless of the birth cohort, more or less 40% of women who entered into union for the first time, they did it within the context of extended household. So they stayed with parents, or where they moved to parents-in-laws when they form a union. So these women may have less children than before, but many of these transitions happen within the context of extended household. It's also very common that when these women have children and the partner disappears, leaves, they divorce, it's a union dissolution and so on, there's also a high proportion of them that move from a nuclear household, so they stop living with the partner and children, but then once they become separated, they move to the parents' home, and that creates another complex household. So I would say a large fraction of the heterogeneity that we see in Latin America comes from the fact that many transitions, either to first union, to first union dissolution, to first children, happen within the context of extended families. And that's important to know. In Africa, we are basically seeing two sources of heterogeneity. And one is the influence of polygamy. So this is a map. I don't have a data specific on polygamy, but this is a map that shows how different are the average household size in Africa. And this is a map that is not 100% correlated with fertility, okay? It is a map that is correlated with the presence of other relatives. And other relatives might be second wife, third wife in countries where polygamy, but also there's another element that is child fostering. It's a very large proportion of children or mothers who happen to have children living in a different household. And that creates this complexity that doesn't necessarily change over time, despite the decline infertility. So this is just to show you, we went to Senegal, not physically, but we took the demographic health surveys in Senegal. And then we wanted to measure what proportion of mothers happen to have a kid alive who's not living with them, that these children are living elsewhere. And here we again use birth cohorts. So women in Senegal born in the 1930s compared to women in Senegal born in 1986 or 1996, very recent. And we plot them by age. And this is the proportion of mothers who happen to have at least one child living in a different household. And it's a very, at age 30, 34, it's above 30%. And as you can see, there's no clear sign or evidence that this is declining over time. So there's a persistence. Even demographic change has happened. Even we have a paper where we study the reasons why this is not going down. I'm not going to present it now, but it's what we're seeing is systematically, it's a very important source of heterogeneity and also this persistence of complexity, the stable presence of child fostering in many sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, in Asia, East Asia, what we're seeing basically is that it's true that the traditional intergenerational co-residence, so married sons living with their parents, bringing the wife to the parents' home, is declining everywhere. But at the same time, it's true that men and women are delaying union formation, and they are very likely to live with parents. Now under a different marital status, and with the added feature that now 30-year-old women are very likely to live with parents in countries like South Korea. So what we're seeing is that there's some sort of a shifting nature of adult intergenerational co-residence, but still at very high levels. That also we're gathering evidence that it's now not necessarily the reason is not because the married children need to take care of the older parents, but maybe the older parents are helping the children also to come with the difficulties of maybe establishing an independent household housing and so on. No? So we see that there's a lot of co-residence between young adults and older persons in Asia, but under a different kind of arrangements. And we're doing research in South Korea and Japan to understand better what's going on there. And also in Europe. In Europe, that from a global perspective looks like a very homogeneous region. What we're seeing is that there are very strong differences still within Europe. And what we're seeing, for instance, in Spain and Sweden. So we went to Sweden. We use the registered data from Sweden, and then we see very nice, this is the co-residence of men and women with their own children, controlling by survival. No? The lines on top are the survival, so how many people have children, but then the dashed, I think it's called, these other lines are the ones who live with children, okay? So in Spain, these are men living with their own children in Spain, the blue color, and the yellow color are men, Swedish men living with their own children. As you see the difference that Swedish children, they leave the parental home as early as they reach age 18, 19, 20. But Spain stay longer, but they also stay at the very old ages. So 25% of 80-year-old men in Spain live with their own children, but only less than 4 or 3% in Sweden. So there are some large difference in co-residence between Spain and Sweden that show why still we're not converging to the same. So now to understand all these changes and say, how can we connect this with theory? we are now working a lot on the social stratification of living arrangements, because the idea was that, okay, what the theory says is high educated individuals are the ones who are more likely to live independent of other family members. And we look whether this holds through across societies and whether this is, then from that finding, we can expect that sooner or later, as these societies become more highly educated, a convergence to a more nuclear living and kind of disappearance of all these regional heterogeneities will happen soon or later. But to our surprise, we are not finding evidence of this educational gradient. And we have several examples across countries and societies where we can really show that this is not necessarily the case. I'm showing the case of Latin America, for instance. So we have single mothers with primary or less education, single mothers with secondary or less education, or single mothers with tertiary education. And these are all the countries within this box plot. And we see that the single mothers who are more likely to live in an extended household are the high educated. But also in South Korea, the young guys and married young guys who are more likely to live with parents are the high educated. And with these findings, we're now doing a global research that say, is it true that extended forms of living arrangements are more common among the low educated compared to the high educated? We should expect like a positive educational gradient, meaning that high educated people are more likely to live in nuclear households compared to low educated people. And here what we're doing right now is a global analysis identifying those people who are married or with a partner, living with a partner. We only focus on those who are already in a union. And we compare the education, the level of nuclearity among the high educated and the positive, and the level of nuclearity among the low educated. And then we see whether there's a positive educational gradient or there's no positive educational gradient. And when we look at the trends over time, and here sorted by the overall level of education across society, is kind of a measure of time too. We see that in Europe, we systematically see this positive educational gradient that the theory predicts. High educated people, married people, are more likely to live in nuclear households compared to low educated people that might need more resources and they live in a more complex organization thing. But this is not the case in Africa. This is not the case in Latin America. This is not the case in many Asian countries. So we're kind of shocked with this reverse educational gradient. And this is the latest news from the project where we're trying now to understand why do we see these negative gradients that run against the idea that higher education, higher economic power, and so on will lead to more nuclear households. That's the basic mechanism that the big theory establishes to justify this convergence. No? So since I'm a very inductive researcher and I don't usually don't use hypotheses to guide my research, it's more a matter of curiosity. But the ultimate goal of the project is to provide an explanation that kind of encompasses all these singularities and things that we're seeing differently. And here I had to partner with some scholars like Frank Furstenberg, Andrew Cherlin, with seeing the results together. No? And that's the challenge for my project for the next 2 years or a year and a half, that try to come with an explanation. No? And so far what we have this basic idea that this intergenerational co-residence basically emerges when there is a need for either one or both generations to get support from the other. But there is also another condition that one of the generations has to have the capacity to provide that support. And when we introduce this idea of the capacity, that maybe explain why we have these negative, positive gradients depending on the context. So I think I'm kind of done with my presentation. I'm happy to share the slides. I showed a lot of things, but I think we're running out of time, and all questions are welcomed. And yeah, thank you.